And now, Under the Pyramids, written by H.P. Lovecraft, with Harry Houdini. Mystery attacks mystery. Ever since the wide appearance of my name as a performer of unexplained feats, I have encountered strange narratives and events, and which my calling has led people to link me with my interests and activities. Some of these have been trivial and irrelevant, some deeply dramatic and absorbent, productive of weird and perilous experiences, and of some involving in extensive scientific and historical research. Many of these matters I have told, and continue to tell freely, for there is one of which I speak with great reluctance, and I am only relating after a session of grilling persuasion from the publishers of this magazine, who had heard vague rumors of it from other members of my family. The hitherto guarded subject pertains to my non-professional visit to Egypt 14 years ago, and has been avoided by me for several reasons. One thing, I am averse to exploiting several unmistakably casual facts and conditions, obviously unknown to the myriad tourists who throng the pyramids and apparently secreted without much diligence by the authorities at Cairo, who cannot be wholly ignorant of them. For another thing, I dislike to recount an incident in which my own fantastic imagination must have played so great a part. What I saw or thought I saw certainly did not take place, but was rather to be viewed as a result of my then recent readings in Egyptology, and of speculations arent to this theme which my environment naturally prompted. These imaginative stimuli, magnified by the excitement of an actual event terrible enough in itself, undoubtedly gave rise to the culminating horror of that grotesque night so long past. In January 1910, I had finished a professional engagement in England, and signed a contract of tour of Australian theatres. A liberal time being allowed for the trip, I determined to make the most of it in the sort of travel which chiefly interests me. So, accompanied with my wife, I drifted pleasantly down the continent, and embarked at Marseilles on the P&O, steamer Mulva, bound by Port Said. For that point I proposed to visit the principal historical localities of Lower Egypt, before finally leaving for Australia. The voyage was an agreeable one, and enlivened by many of the amusing incidents which befall a magical performer apart from his work. I had intended, for the sake of quiet travel, to keep my name a secret, but was goaded into betraying myself by a fellow musician, whose anxiety to astound the passengers with ordinary tricks tempted me to duplicate and exceed his feats in a manner quite destructive of my incognito. I imagine this is for its ultimate effect, an effect I might have foreseen before unmasking to a shipload of tourists about to scatter throughout the Nile Valley. Where it went and where it was to herald my identity wherever I subsequently went, and deprive my wife and me of all the placid inconspicuousness we had sought. Traveling to and to seek curiosities, I was often forced to stand inspection as sort of a curiosity myself. We had come to Egypt in search of the picturesque and the mystically impressive, but found little enough when the ship edged to Port Said and discharged its passengers in small boats. Low dunes of sand, bobbing buoys in shallow water, and a dreary Eritrean small town with nothing of interest, save the great Lesseps statue, made us anxious to get on with something more than worth our while. After some discussion, we decided to proceed at once to Cairo and the pyramids, later going to Alexandria and the Australian boat for whatever Greco-Roman sites the ancient metropolis might present. The railway journey was tolerable enough, and consumed only 4 hours and a half. We saw the Suez Canal, whose route we followed as far as Ismailia, and later had a taste of old Egypt, in all our glimpse of the restored freshwater canal of the Middle Empire. Then at last we saw Cairo glimmering through the glowing dusk, a twinkling constellation which became a blaze as we halted at the great Caire Centrale. But once more disappointment awaited us, for all that we beheld was European save for the costumes and the crowds. A prosaic subway led to a square teeming with carriages, taxicabs, and trolley cars, gorgeous with electric lights shining on tall buildings, whilst the very theatre I was vainly requested to play, and which I had later attended as a spectator, had been recently renamed the American Cosmograph. We stopped at Shepherd's Hotel, reached a taxi that sped along broad, smartly built-up streets, amidst the perfect service of its restaurants, elevators, and generally Anglo-American luxuries. The mysterious East, in immemorial past, seemed very far away. The next day, however, precipitated us delightfully into the heart of the Arabian Nights atmosphere, and in the winding ways and exotic skyline of Cairo, the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid seemed to live again. Guided by Baedeker, we struck east past the Izbekia gardens along the Muski in quest of the native quarter, and were soon in the hands of a clamorous cicerone who, notwithstanding later developments, was assuredly a master of his trade. Not until afterward did I see that this should have applied at the hotel for a licensed guide. This man, a shaven, particularly hollow-voiced and relatively cleanly fellow who looked like a pharaoh and called himself Abdul Royce Drogman, appeared to have much power over others of his kind, though subsequently the police professed not to know him, or to suggest that Royce is merely a name for any person in authority, where Drogman is obviously no more than a clumsy modification of the word for a leader of tourist parties, dragoman. Abdul led us through such wonders as we had never seen or only read or dreamed of. Old Cairo is itself a storybook and a dream, labyrinths of narrow alleyways redolent of aromatic secrets, arabesque balconies in one oath, nearly meeting above the cobbled streets, maelstroms of oriental traffic and strange cries, cracking whips, rattling carts, jingling money, and braying donkeys, kaleidoscopes of polychrome robes, veils, turbans, turbashes, water carriers and dervishes, dogs and cats, soothsayers and barbers, and all over the whining blind beggars crouched in alcoves, and the sonorous chanting of muezzins from minarets limned delicately across the sky of deep, unchanging blue. The roofed, quieter bazaars were hardly less alluring. Spice, perfume, incense, beads, rugs, silks, and brass. Old Mahmoud Suleiman, squat-legged, across his gummies bottles, while chattering leaves pulverized mustard in the hollowed-out capital of the ancient classic column. A Roman Corinthian, perhaps from neighboring Heliopolis, where Augustus stationed one of his 3 Egyptian legions. Antiquity begins to mingle with the exoticism, and then the mosques in our museum. We saw them all, and tried not to let our Arabian revel succumb to the darker charm of Pharaonic Egypt, when the museum's priceless treasures have offered. That was to be our climax, and the present we concentrated on medieval Saracenic glories of the caliphs, whose magnificent tomb mosques form a glittering fairy necropolis on the edge of the Arabian desert. At length, Abdul took us among the Sharia Muhammad Ali to the ancient mosque of Sultan Hassan and tower-flanked Bab el-Zab, where below climbs the steep-walled pass to the mighty citadel Saladin himself built with the stones of forgotten pyramids. It was sunset when we scaled that cliff, circled the modern mosque of Muhammad Ali, and looked down from the dizzying parapet over mystic scales. Cairo, golden with its carven domes, its ethereal minarets, and its flaming gardens. Far over the city towered the great Roman dome of the new museum, and beyond it, across from the cryptic hollow, the yellow Nile that is the mother of aeons and dynasties, lurked the menacing sands of the Libyan desert, undulant and iridescent with evil and older arcana. The red sun sank low, bringing the relentless chill of Egyptian dusk, as it stood poised on the world's rim, like that ancient god of Heliopolis, Re-Hekart, the horizon sun. And we saw silhouetted against its vermeil holocausts the black tombs of the pyramids of Giza. The Pelagian tombs were there hoary with 1,000 years when Tutankhamun mounted his golden throne in distant Thebes. Then we knew they were done with Saracen Cairo, and we must taste the deeper mysteries of primal Egypt. The black Chem and Re of Amen, Isis, and Osiris. The next morning we visited the pyramids, riding out Victoria across Great Nile Bridge with its bronze lions, the island of Gizera with its massive lebbak trees, and the massive English bridge to the western shore. Down the shore we drove, and between great rows of lebbaks past the vast zoological gardens to the suburb of Giza, where a new bridge to Cairo proper had since been built. Then turning inland along to the Sharia Haram, we crossed a region of glassy canals and shabby native villages, till before us loomed the objects of our quest, cleaving the mists of dawn and vorting and forming inverted replicas in the roadside pools. 40 centuries as Napoleon had told his campaigners there, indeed looked down upon us. The road now rose abruptly till we finally reached our place of transfer between the trolley station and the Mena House Hotel. Abdul Rees, who capably purchased our pyramid tickets, seemed to have an understanding with the shouting, yelling, and offensive Bedouins, who inhabited a squalid mud village some distance away, and pestiferously assailed every traveller, for he kept them very decently at bay, and secured an excellent pair of camels for us, himself mounting a donkey, and assigning the leadership of our animals to a group of men and boys, more expensive than usual. This area to be traversed was not small, the camels were hardly needed, but we need not regret adding to our experience this troublesome form of desert navigation. The pyramids stand on a high rock plateau, this group forming next to the northernmost series of regal and aristocratic cemeteries built in the neighborhood of the extinct capital, Memphis, which lay on the same side of the Nile, somewhat south of Giza, and which flourished between 3,400 and 2,000 BC. The greatest pyramid, which lies at the modern road, was built by King Cheops, or Khufu, in the reign of King Khephren. Though slightly smaller and looking even larger because set on higher ground, the radically similar small third pyramid of King Mycerinus, built in 2700 BC, near the edge of our plateau and due east of the second pyramid. With a face probably altered to form a colossal portrait of Khephren, its royal restorer, stands the monstrous Sphinx, mute, sardonic, and wise beyond mankind in memory. Minor pyramids and the traces of ruined minor pyramids are found in several places, and the whole plateau is pitted with the tombs of dignitaries of less than royal rank. These latter were originally marked by mastabas, or stone bench-like structures in about the deep burial shafts, as found by other Memphian cemeteries, and exemplified by Penham's tomb and the Metropolitan Museum of New York. At Giza, all such visible things had been swept away by time and pillage, and only the rock-hewn shafts, either sand-filled or cleared out by archaeologists, remained to attest their former existence. Connected with each tomb was a chapel in which priests and relatives offered food or prayer to the hovering Ka, or vital principle of the deceased. The small tombs have their chapels contained, and their stone mastabas, or superstructures, but the mortuary chapels of the pyramids, where regal pharaohs lay, were separate temples, each to the east of corresponding pyramids, and connected by a causeway to a massive gate chapel or propylon at the edge of the rock plateau. The gate chapel leading to the second pyramid, nearly buried in the drifting sands, yawns subterraneously the southeast of the Sphinx. Persistent tradition dubs it the Temple of the Sphinx, and it may perhaps be rightly called such, as the Sphinx indeed represents the second pyramid's builder, Khephren. There are unpleasant tales of the Sphinx before Khephren, but whatever its elder features were, the monarch that replaced him with his own, that men might look upon the Colossus without fear. It was in the great gateway temple that the life-size diorite of statue of Khephren now stood in the Cairo Museum where it was found, and a statue before which I stood in awe when I beheld it. Whether the whole edifice is now excavated, I am not certain, but in 1910 most of it was below ground, with the entrance heavily barred at night. Germans were in charge of the work, and if the war or other things may have stopped them. I would give much in view of my experience, and of certain Bedouin whisperings, discredited or unknown in Cairo, to know what had developed in connection with a certain well-traversed gallery where statues of the pharaoh were found in curious juxtaposition to the statues of baboons. The road as we traversed it on our camels this morning curved sharply past the wooden police quarters, post office, drugstore, and shops on the left, plunged south and east in a complete bend that scaled the rock plateau and brought us face to face with the desert under the lee of the Great Pyramid. Past Cyclopean masonry we rode, rounding the eastern face and looking down into the valley of minor pyramids, beyond which the eternal Nile glistened to the east, the eternal desert shimmered to the west. Very close boomed the three major pyramids, the greatest deformed of outer casing and strewing its bulk with great stones, but the others retaining there and there the fitted covering which had made them as smooth and finished in their day. Presently we descended towards the Sphinx, and sat silent beneath the spell of those terrible unseeing eyes. At the vast stone breasts we faintly discerned the emblem of Re-Ka-Ka, whose image the Sphinx was mistaken for in a late dynasty, and though sand covered the tablet, between the great paws, we recall to Moses inscribed thereon. And the dream he had when he was a prince. It was then the smile of the Sphinx vaguely displeased us, and made us wonder about the legends of the subterranean passages beneath the monstrous creature, leading down, down to depths none might dare hint at, a depths connected with mysteries older than a dynastic Egypt, which we excavate, and having a sinister relation to the persistence and abnormal, animal-headed gods of the ancient Nilotic pantheon. Then, too, I was asked myself an idle question whose hideous significance did not appear for many an hour. Other tourists now began to overtake us, and we moved on to the sand-choked temple of the Sphinx, 50 yards to the southeast, which I had previously mentioned as the Great Gate of the Causeway, the second pyramid's mortuary temple of the plateau. Most of it was still underground, and though we dismounted and descended through a modern passageway to an alabaster corridor and pillared hall, I felt that Abdul and the local German attendant had not shown us all there was to see. After this, we made this conventional circuit of the pyramid plateau, examining the second pyramid and the peculiar ruins of its mortuary chapel to the east, the third pyramid and its miniature southern satellites, ruined eastern chapel, and fourth, rock tombs and honeycombings of the 4th and 5th dynasties, and Campbell's famous tomb, whose shadowy shaft sinks precipitously for 53 feet to a sinister sarcophagi, whose one of our camel drivers divested of the cumbering sand after a vertiginous descent by rope. Cries were now assailed by the Great Pyramid, where Bedouins were besieging a group of tourists with offers of guidance to the top, or of displays of speed in the performance of solitary trips up and down. 7 minutes it is said to be the record for such an ascent and descent, but many lusty sheiks and sons of sheiks assured us they could cut it to 5 if given the requisite impetus of liberal baksheesh. They did not get this impetus, and though we did let Abdul take us up, thus obtaining a view of unprecedented magnificence, which only included not remote and glittering Cairo, but its crowned citadel and background of gold-violet hills, all the pyramids of the Memphian district as well, from Abu Rosh to the north to Dashur in the south, the Saqqara step pyramid, which marks the evolution of Low Mastaba into the true pyramid, shewed clearly and alluringly in a standing distance. It is close to this transition monument that this famed tomb of Perneb was found, more than 400 miles north of the Theban Rock Valley, where Tutankhamun sleeps. I was forced to silence through sheer awe. The prospect of such antiquity and the secrets of such hoary monuments seemed to hold and brood over me, filled me with reverence and sense of immensity nothing else ever gave me. Fatigued by our climb, and disgusted by the importunate Bedouins, whose actions seemed to defy every rule of taste, we omitted the arduous detail of entering the cramped interior passages of any of the pyramids, though we saw several of the hardiest tourists preparing for the suffocating draw through Cheops' mightiest memorial. As we dismissed and overpaid our local bodyguard and drove back to Cairo with Abdul Rees under the afternoon sun, we half regretted this omission we had made. Such fascinating things were whispered about Lower Pyramid Passage, not heard in the guidebooks, whose passages had entrances hastily blocked up and concealed by certain uncommunicative archaeologists who had found and begun to explore them. Of course, this whispering was largely baseless on the face of it, but it was curious to reflect on persistent villagers who were forbidden to enter the pyramids at night, or to visit the lowest burrows and the crypt of the Great Pyramid. Perhaps in the latter case, it was the psychological effect which was feared, the effect of visitors feeling themselves huddled down beneath a gigantic world of solid masonry, joined to the life he had known by the merest tube, which he might only crawl, and which by accident or evil design might block. The whole subject seemed so weird and alluring that we resolved to pay the Pyramid Plateau another visit at the earliest possible opportunity. For me, this opportunity came much earlier than expected. That evening, the members of our party feeling somewhat tired after the strenuous program of the day, I went alone with Abdul Rees for a walk through the picturesque Arab quarter. Though I had seen it by day, I wished to study the alleys and bazaars in the dusk, when rich shadows and mellow gleams of light would add to their glamour and fantastic illusion. The native crowds were thinning, but were still very noisy and numerous when we came upon a knot of revelling Bedouins in silken nashin, or bazaar in the coppersmiths. The apparent leader, an insolent youth with heavy features and socially cut tarbrush, took some notice of us, and evidently recognized with no great friendliness my competent, but immediately supercilious and sneeringly disposed guide. Perhaps, I thought, he resented that odd reproduction of the Sphinx half-smile, which I did not often remarked with amused irritation, or perhaps he did not like the hollow and sculptural resonance of Abdul's voice. At any rate, the exchange of ancestrally opprobrious language became very brisk, and before long, Ali Aziz, as I heard the stranger called, when he called by no worse name, began to violently pull at Abdul's robe. Action quickly reciprocated, and leading to a spirited scuffle, in which both combatants lost their sacredly cherished headgear, and would not have reached an even dire condition had I not intervened and separated them by force. My interference, at first seemingly welcome with both sides, succeeded in at last effecting a truce. Suddenly, each belligerent composer, he wrath, he subdued his wrath in his attire, with an assumption of dignity as profound as when it was sudden. The two formed a curious pact of honor, which I soon learned is custom in great antiquity in Cairo, a pact for the settlement of their disputes, by no means of a nocturnal fistfight atop the Great Pyramid, long after the departure of the last moonlight sightseer. Each duelist was assembled to a party of seconds, and the affair was to begin at midnight, proceeding by rounds the most civilized fashion. In this planning there was much to be exciting my interest. The fight itself promised to be unique and spectacular, while the thought of the scene on that hoary pile overlooking the antediluvian plateau of Giza, under the wan moon of the pallid small hours, appealed to every fibre of imagination in me. A request found Abdul exceedingly willing to admit me to his party of seconds, so that the rest of the nightly evening I accompanied him to various dens of the most lawless regions of the town, most northeast of the Izbekia, where he gathered by one a select and formidable band of congenial cutthroats and his pugilistic background. Shortly after 9, our party mounted on donkeys bearing such royal or tourist reminiscent names as Ramses, Mark Twain, J.P. Morgan, or Minnehaha, edged through street labyrinths on Oriental and Occidental, crossed the muddy and mast-forested Nile for the Bridge of the Bronze Lions, and cantered philosophically between the Lebzaks on the road to Giza. Slightly after 2 hours were consumed by the trip, towards the end of which we passed the last of our returning tourists, saluted in last, inbound trolley car, and were bound over the night, and the past, and the spectral moon. Then we saw the vast pyramids at the end of the avenue, ghoulish, with a dim atavistical menace which had not seemed to notice in the daytime. Even the smallest of them had a hint of the ghastly, for it was this that had buried Queen Nycteris alive in the 6th dynasty, subtle Queen Nycteris, who once invited all of her enemies to a feast in the temple below the Nile, and drowned them by opening the water gates. I recall that Arabs whisper things about Nycteris, and shun the third periods, at certain hours and certain phases of the moon. It must have been over her that Thomas More was brooding when he wrote a thing he muttered by a Memphis boatman. The subterranean nymph that dwells, mid sunless gems and glories hid, the lady of the pyramid. As early as we were, Ali Aziz and his party were ahead of us, for we saw their donkeys outlined against the desert plateau and Kafar al-Haram, towards their squalid Arab settlement, close to the Sphinx. We had divulged instead of following the regular road to the manor house, where some of the sleepy, inefficient police may have observed and halted us. Here, where filthy Bedouins stabled camels and donkeys in the rock tombs of the Kefren's courtiers, we were led over rocks and sand to the Great Pyramid, whose time-worn slides the Arabs swarmed eagerly, Abdul Rice offering me the assistance I did not need. As most travelers know, the actual apex of this structure has long been worn away, leaving a reasonably flat platform 12 yards square. On this eerie pinnacle, a squared circle was formed, and in a few moments the sardonic desert moon leered down on a battle which, for the quality of the ringside cries, might well have occurred in some minor athletic club in America. As I watched it, I felt for some of our less desirable institutions were not lacking, for every blow, feint in defence, spoke stalling to not my experienced eye. It was quickly over, and despite my beginnings to the methods, I felt a sort of proprietary pride when Abdul Rice was adjudged the winner. Reconciliation was phenomenally rapid, and amidst the singing, fraternizing, and drinking which followed, I found it difficult to realize that a quarrel had ever occurred. Oddly enough, I seemed to myself to be more of the center of notice than the antagonists, and from my smattering of Arabic, I judged that they were discussing my professional performances and escapes, and sorts of manacles and confinement, in a manner which indicated to me not only a surprising knowledge, but a distinct hostility and skepticism concerning my feats of escape. It gradually dawned on me that leaving the elder magic of Egypt did not depart without leaving traces, and that within fragments of a strange secret lore and priestly cult practices of it survive surreptitiously amongst the Fellahin to such an extent that the prowess of a strange Hahwi or musician is resented and disputed. I thought of how much my lullaby voice fied. Abdul Rice looked like an old Egyptian priest or pharaoh, smiling sphinx, and wondered. Suddenly something happened within a flash, connected to the correctness of my reflections, and made me curse the denseness whereby I had accepted this night's events as any other than the empty and malicious frame they now shewed themselves to be. Without warning, and doubtless in answer to some subtle sign from Abdul, the entire band of Bedouins precipitated itself upon me, and having produced heavy ropes, had soon had me bound up as securely as if I was bound up in the course of my life, either on the stage or off. I struggled at first, but soon saw that one man could make no headway against a band of 20 sinewy barbarians. My hands were tied behind my back, my knees bent to their fullest extent, and my wrists and ankles stoutly linked together with unyielding cords. A stifling gag was forced into my mouth, and a blindfold fastened tightly over my eyes. Then, as the Arabs bore me aloft on their shoulders, and began a jouncing descent of the pyramid, I heard taunts of my late guide Abdul, who mocked and jeered delightedly in his hollow voice. But assuredly I was soon to have my magic powers put to a supreme test, which would quickly remove any egotism I might have gained through triumphing over all the tests offered in America or Europe. Egypt, he reminded me, is very old, and full of inner mysteries and antique powers which not even conceivable to the experts of today, whose devices had uniformly failed to entrap me. How far or in which direction I was carried I cannot tell, but for the circumstances all were against the formation of any accurate judgment. I know, however, that it could not be for a great distance, since my bearers at no point hastened beyond a walk, yet kept me aloft for a surprising short time. It was in this perplexing brevity which makes me feel as if shuddering whenever I think of Giza or its plateau, for one is oppressed by hints of closeness to everyday tourist routes, and what existed then, and must exist still. The even abnormality I spoke of, which did not become manifest at first, setting me down on a surface which recognized as sand rather than rock. My captors passed a rope round my chest and dragged me to a few feet of a ragged opening in the crowd, which they presently lowered me with much rough handling. For apparent eons I bumped against stony irregular sides of a narrow-hewn well, which I took to be one of the numerous burial shafts of the plateau of the prodigious, almost incredible depths. It robbed me of all basis of conjecture. The horror of the experience deepened with every dragging second. That any descent through the sheer solid rock could be so vast, without reaching the core of the planet itself, or that any rope made by man could be so long as to dangle me in these unholy and seemingly fathomless profundities of nether earth, were beliefs of such grotesqueness that it was easier for me to doubt my agitated senses than to accept them. Even now I am uncertain, for I know how deceitful the usual perceptions of conditions of life are removed, or when they are distorted, but I am quite sure that I preserved a logical consciousness that far, for at least I did not add any full-grown phantoms of imagination to a picture hideous enough in its reality, and inexplicable by a type of cerebral illusion, vastly short of actual hallucination. All this was not the cause of my first bit of fainting. The shocking ideal was cumulative, and the beginning of the later terrors was a very perceptible increase in my rate of descent. They were paying out that infinitely long rope very swiftly now, and I scraped cruelly against the rough and constricted sides of the shaft as I swept madly downwards. My clothing was in tatters, and I felt the trickle of blood all over, even about the mounting and excruciating pain. My nostrils, too, were assailed by a scarcely definable menace, a creeping odor of damp, stain was curiously unlike anything I had ever smelt before, and having faint overtones of spice and incense that lent an element of mockery. Then this mental cataclysm came. It was horrible, hideous beyond all articulate description, because of all of the soul, with nothing of detail to describe. It was the ecstasy of nightmare, and the summation of the fiendish. The suddenness of it was apocalyptic and demonic. Down that narrow well of million-toothed torture. Yet next moment I was soaring on bat wings to the gulfs of hell, swinging free and swooping through inimitable miles of boundless musty space, rising dizzily to measureless pinnacles of chilling ether, to sucking naders of ravening. God for the mercy that shut out oblivion in those clawing furies of consciousness which half unhinged my faculties and tore harpy-like at my spirit. That one respite, short as it was, gave me strength and sanity enough to endure those still greater sublimations of the cosmic panic that lurked and gibbered in the road ahead. It was very gradually that I regained my senses after eldritch flight through Stygian space. The process was infinitely painful and coloured by fantastic dreams, in which my bound and gagged condition found singular embodiment. The precise nature of these dreams was very clear while I was experiencing them, but became blurred in my recollection almost immediately afterwards, and was soon reduced to the merest outline of terrible events, real or imaginary, which followed. I dreamed that I was in the grasp of a great and horrible paw, a yellow, hairy, five-clawed paw, which had reached out of the earth to crush and engulf me. And when stopped to reflect what the paw was, it seemed to me that it was Egypt. In the dream I looked back on the events in the preceding weeks, and saw myself lured and enmeshed, little by little, suddenly and insidiously, by some hellish ghoul spirit of the Elder Nile sorcery, some spirit that was in Egypt before man ever was, and will be when man is no more. I saw the horror and unwholesome antiquity of Egypt, and the grisly alliance it had always had with the tombs and temples of the dead. I saw phantom processions of priests with the heads of bulls, falcons, cats, and ibises, phantom processions marching interminably through subterraneous labyrinths and avenues of titanic propylae, beside which a man is a fly, and offering unnameable sacrifices to indescribable gods. Stone colossi marched in endless night, and drove herds of grinning andro-sphinxes down to the shores of illimitable, stagnant rivers of pitch. And behind it all, I saw the ineffable malignity of primordial necromancy, black and amorphous, and fumbling greedily after me in the darkness to choke out the very spirit that dared not to mock it by emulation. In spirited brain and in sleep there took shape a melodied drama of sinister hatred in spirit. In pursuit I saw the black soul of Egypt signaling me out and calling me in inaudible whispers, calling me and luring me, leading me with the glitter and glamour of a Saracenic surface, while pulling me down to the age-mad catacombs and the horrors of its dead and abysmal pharaonic heart. There I saw the dream faces took on human resemblances, and I saw my guide Abdul Race in the robes of a king, with the sneer of the Sphinx in its features. And I knew whose features those were. They were of Khephren of Great, who raised the second pyramid, carved over the Sphinx's face in the likeness of his own, and built that titanic gateway temple, whose myriad corridors the archaeologists think they have dug out of the cryptable sand and the uninformative rock. And I looked at the long, lean, rigid hand of Khephren, the long, lean, rigid hand I had seen in the diorite statue in the Cairo Museum, the statue they had found in the terrible Gateway Temple. And I wondered had I not shrieked when I saw it on Abdul Reach. That hand, it was hideously cold, and it was crushing me. That was the cold and cramping of the sarcophagus, the chill and constriction of unrememberable Egypt. It was that night at necropole in Egypt itself, that yellow paw, and I whisper such things of Khephren. And at this juncture I began to awake, or at least to assume a condition less completely that of sleep that I was just proceeding. I recalled the fight atop the pyramid, the treacherous Bedouins and their attack, the frightful descent by rope through endless rock depths, and my mad swinging and plunging into a chill void redolent of aromatic putrescence. I perceived that I now lay on a damp rock floor, and that my bones were still biting into me with unloosened force. It was very cold, and I seemed to detect a faint current of noticeable air sweeping towards me. The cuts and bruises I had received from the jagged sides of the rock shaft were paining me woefully, and their soreness enhanced to a stinging and burning acuteness by some pungent quality in the faint draught, and the mere act of rolling over was enough to set my whole frame throbbing with untold agony. As I turned, I felt a tug from above, and concluded that the rope whereby I was lowered still reached to the surface. Whether or not the Arab still held it, I had no idea, nor had I any idea how far the earth within I was. I knew that the darkness around me was wholly or nearly total, since no ray or moonlight penetrated my blindfold. I did not trust my senses enough to accept as evidence of extreme depth the sensation of aspiration which had characterized my descent. Knowing that at least I was in a space of some considerable extent, reached from the surface directly above by an opening in a rock, I doubtfully conjectured that my prison was perhaps the buried gateway chapel of old Kefren, the temple of the Sphinx, perhaps some inner corridor which guides me had not shown me during my morning visit, and from which I might easily escape if I could find my way to the barred entrance. It would be a labyrinth and wandering, yet no worse than others out of which I've had to find my way in the past. The first step was to get free of my bonds, gag and blindfold, and this, I knew, would be no great task, since subtler experts than these Arabs had tried every known species of fetter upon me during my long and varied career as an exponent of escape, yet had never succeeded in defeating my methods. Then it occurred to me that the Arabs might be ready to meet and attack me at the entrance upon the evidence of my probable escape from the binding cords, as would be furnished by any decided agitation of the rope, which they probably held. This, of course, was taking for granted my place in confinement was indeed in Kefren's temple of the Sphinx. The direct opening into the roof, wherever it might lurk, could not be beyond easy reach of the ordinary modern entrance near the Sphinx, if in truth it were any great distance at all on the surface, since the total area known to visitors is not at all enormous. I had not noticed any such opening during my daytime pilgrimage, but knew these things are easily overlooked amongst the drifting sands. Thinking these matters over as I bent and lay bound on the rock floor, I nearly forgot the horrors of the abysmal descent and the cavernous swinging which had so lately reduced me to a coma. I presently thought that it was only to outwit the Arabs, and I accordingly determined to work myself free and quickly as possible to avoid any tug on the descending line which might betray an effective or even problematical attempt at freedom. This, however, was more easily determined than effected. A few preliminary trials made it clear that little could be accomplished without considerable motion, and did it not surprise me, after one energetic struggle, I began to feel the coils of falling rope as they piled up about me and upon me. Obviously, as I thought, the Bedouins had felt my movements and released their end of the rope, hastening no doubt to the temple's true entrance to lie murderously in wait for me. The prospect was not pleasing, but I had faced worse in my time without flinching, and would not flinch now. At present I first must free myself of all bonds, then trust to ingenuity to escape the temple unharmed. It is curious how implicitly I had come to believe myself in the old temple of Kefren beside the Sphinx, only a short distance below the ground. That belief was shattered, and every pristine apprehension of preternatural depth and demonic mystery revived by a circumstance which grew in horror and significance, even as I formulated my philosophical plan. As I have said, the falling rope was piling up upon me. Now I saw that it was continuing to pile, as if no rope or normal length could possibly do. It gained in momentum, and became an avalanche of hemp, accumulating mountainously on the floor, and half burying me within its swiftly multiplying coils. Soon I was completely engulfed, and gasping for breath, as the increasing convolutions submerged and stifled me. My senses tottered again, and I vainly tried to fend off a menace desperate and ineluctable. It was not merely that I was tortured beyond human endurance, not merely that life and breath seemed to be crushed slowly out of me. It was the knowledge of what these unnatural lengths of rope implied, and consciousness of what unknown and unincalculable gulfs of earth this moment might be surrounding me. My endless descent and swinging flight through goblin space then must have been real, and even now I must be lying helpless in some nameless cavern world towards the core of the planet. Such a sudden confirmation of ultimate horror was insupportable, and a second time I lapsed into merciful oblivion. When I say oblivion, I do not imply that I was free from dreams. On the contrary, my absence from the conscious world was marked by visions of the most unutterable hideousness. Good, if only I had not read so much Egyptology before coming to this land, which is the fountain of all darkness and terror. The second spell of fainting filled my sleeping mind anew with shivering realization of the country and its archaic secrets, and through some damnable chance my dreams turned into ancient notions of the dead and their sojournings, in soul and body, beyond these mysterious tombs, which were more houses than graves. I recalled in dream shapes, which it is well that I do not remember, the peculiar and elaborate construction of Egyptian sepulchres, and the exceeding singular and terrific doctrines which determined this construction. All of these people thought it was death in the dead, and they conceived of a literal resurrection of the body, which made them mummify it in desperate care, and to preserve all the vital organs in canopy jars near the corpse, whilst beside the body they believed in two other elements: the soul, which after its waiting and approval by Osiris dwelt in the land of the blessed, and the obscure and portentous Ka or life principle, which wandered about the upper and lower worlds in a horrible way, demanding occasional access to the preserved body, consuming the food offerings brought by priests and pious relatives to the mortuary chapel, and sometimes, as men whispered, taking its body and wooden double always buried beside it, and stalking anxiously abroad on errands particularly repellent. For thousands of years those bodies rested, gorgeously encased, and staring glassily upward, when not visited by the Ka, awaiting the day when Osiris would restore both Ka and soul, and lead forth the stiff legions of the dead from the sunken houses of sleep. It was to have been a glorious rebirth, but not all souls were have been approved, not all were tombs inviolate, so certain grotesque mistakes and fiendish abominations were to have been looked for. Even today the Arabs murmur of unsanctified convocations and unwholesome worship and forgotten nether abysses, which can only winged invisible Kas and soulless mummies may visit and return unscathed. Perhaps these are the most leeringly blood-congealing legends of those that can relate to certain perverse products of decadent priestcrafts, composite mummies made by the artificial union of human trunks with limbs of the heads of animals in an imitation of the elder gods. At all stages of history, the sacred animals were mummified, so that consecrated bulls, cats, ibises, crocodiles, and the like might return some day to greater glory. But only in the decadence did they mix the human and the animal in the same mummy. Only in the decadence, when they did not understand the rights and prerogatives of the Ka and of the soul. What happened to those composite mummies is not told of, at least publicly, and it is certain that no Egyptologist ever found one. The whispers of Arabs are very wild, and cannot be replied upon. They even hint that the old Khephren, he of the Sphinx, of the second pyramid and the yawning gateway temple, lives far underground, wedded to the ghoul queen Nectarus, and brooding over the mummies that are either neither man nor beast. It is one of these, of Khephren and his consort, that the strange armies of the hybrid dead, that I dreamed, and that is why the exact dream shapes had faded from my memory. The most horrible vision was connected to an idle question I had asked myself the day before, looking at the great carven riddle of the desert, and wondering with what unknown depths the temple, so close, it might be secretly connected. My question, so innocently and whimsical then, assumed in my dream a meaning of frenetic and historical madness. What huge and loathsome abominability the Sphinx was even originally carved to represent! My second awakening, if awakening it was, is a memory of stark hideousness from which nothing else in my life, save one thing that came after, can parallel, and that life has been full of adventures beyond most men's. You remember I had lost consciousness while being buried under a cascade of falling rope, whose immensity revealed to me the cataclysmic depths of my present position. Now, as perception returned, I felt the entire weight gone, and realized upon rolling over that although I was still tied, gagged, and blindfolded, some agency had removed completely the suffocating hempen landslide which had overwhelmed me. The significance of this condition, of course, came to me only gradually. But even as I think it might have been brought consciousness back again, this time reached a state of emotional exhaustion that no new horror could make such difference. I was alone. And with what? Before I could torture myself with any new reflection, or make any fresh effort to escape my bonds, additional circumstances became manifest. Pains not formerly felt were racking my arms and legs, and I seemed coated with a profusion of dried blood beyond anything my former cuts and abrasions could furnish. My chest, too, seemed pierced by 100 wounds, as if though some malign titanic ibis had been pecking on it. Assuredly the agency of which I had removed the rope was a hostile one, and begun to wreak terrible injuries upon me, when I somehow impelled to desist. Yet at the time my sensations were distinctly reverse of what you might expect. Instead of sinking into a bottomless pit of despair, I was now stirred to a new courage of action. For now I felt that the evil forces were physical things that a fearless man might encounter on an even basis. On the strength of this thought I tugged again at my bonds, and used all the art of a lifetime to free myself as I had done so often amidst the glare of lights and applause of vast crowds. The familiar details of my escaping process commenced to engross me, and now that the long rope was gone, I regained my belief that the supreme horrors were hallucinations after all, and that there never been any terrible shaft, measureless abyss, or interminable rope. Was I after all in the gateway of the temple of the Kefren, beside the Sphinx, and had held sneaking Arabs stolen in to torture me as I lay helpless there? At any rate, I must be free. Let me stand up unbound, ungagged, and with eyes open to catch any glimmer of light which might come trickling from any source, and so I might actually delight in the combat against evil and treacherous foes. How long I took in, shaking off my encumbrances, I could not tell. It had been must that I had been there longer than my exposition performances, and because I was wounded, exhausted, and enervated by the experience I had passed through. When I was finally free, taking deep breaths of a chill, damp, evilly spiced air, all the more horrible, I encountered without a screen of gag and blindfold edges. I found that I was too cramped and fatigued to move at once. There I lay, trying to stretch a frame, bent and mangled, for an indefinite period, and straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of some rare light which would give me a hint as to my position. By degrees my strength and flexibility returned, but my eyes beheld nothing. As I staggered to my feet, I peered diligently in every direction, yet met only with an ebony blackness as great as I had known when I was blindfolded. I tried my legs, blood encrusted beneath my shredded trousers, and found that I could walk, yet I could not decide in which direction to go. Obviously, I might walk at random, and perhaps retreat directly into the entrance I so sought. So I paused to note the direction of the cold, fetid, natron-scented air current, which I'd never ceased to feel. Excepting to the point of its source was the possible entrance to the abyss. I stood strove to keep track of this landmark, and walk consistently towards it. I had a matchbox with me, and even as a small electric flashlight, but of course the pockets of my tossed and tattered clothing were long emptied of all heavy articles. As I walked cautiously in the blackness, the draught grew stronger and more offensive, till at length I could regard it as nothing else than a tangible stream of detestable vapour pouring out of some aperture like the smoke of the genie from the fisherman's jar in the Eastern tale. The East, Egypt, truly this dark cradle of civilization, and was ever the wellspring of horrors and marvels unspeakable. The more I reflected on the nature of this cavern wind, the greater my sense of disquiet had become. For although despite its odour, and sought its source as an indirect clue to the outer world, I now saw plainly that this foul emanation could have no admixture or connection whatsoever with the clean air of the Libyan desert, but must be essentially a thing vomited from sinister gulfs still lower down. I had, then, been walking in the wrong direction. From a moment's reflection I decided not to retrace my steps. Away from the draught I would have no landmarks, for the roughly level walk forward was distinctive configurations. If, however, I followed up on the strange current, I would undoubtedly arrive at an aperture of some sort, from whose gate I could perhaps work round the walls to the opposite side of this cyclopean and otherwise unnavigable hole. That I might fail, and that I will realize. I saw that this was no part of Kefren's gateway temple, which terrorists know, and it struck me that this particular hole might be unknown even to archaeologists, and merely stumbled upon in the inquisitive and malignant Arabs who had imprisoned me. If so, was there any present gate of escape to the known parts, or to the outer air? What evidence indeed did I now possess that this was a gateway temple at all? For a moment my wildest speculations rushed back at me, and I thought of vivid melange of impressions, the scent, suspension, the space, the rope, my wounds, and the dreams that were frankly dreams. Was this the end of life for me? Or indeed, would it be merciful if this moment were the end? But I could answer none of my own questions, but merely kept on till fate for a third time reduced me to oblivion. This time there were no dreams. for the suddenness of the incident shocked me out of all thought, either conscious or subconscious. Tripping in an unexpected descending step at a point where the offensive drop became strong enough to offer an actual physical resistance, I was precipitated headlong towards a black flight of huge stone stairs into a gulf of hideousness, unrelieved. That I ever breathed again is a tribute to the inherent vitality of the healthy human organism. Often I look back on that night and feel a touch of actual humor in those repeated lapses of consciousness, lapses whose succession reminded me of the time of nothing more than the crude cinema melodramas of that period. Of course, it is possible that the repeated lapses never occurred, and that all were features of that underground nightmare, were merely dreams of one long coma which began with the shock of my descent into that abyss, and ended with the healing balm of the outer air and of the rising sun, which had found me stretched out on the sands of Giza before the sardonic and dawn-flushed face of the great Sphinx. I prefer to believe this latter explanation as much as I can. Hence I was glad when the police told me that the barrier to Kefren's gateway temple had been found unfastened, and that a sizable rift to the surface was actually to exist in one of the still corner of the buried part. I was glad, too, when the doctors pronounced my wounds only to be found those expected from my seizure, blindfolding, lowering and struggling with bonds, falling some distance, perhaps into a depression of the temple's inner gallery, dragging myself to the outer barrier and escaping from it. Experiences like that, a very soothing diagnosis. And yet I know that there must have been some more than appears on the surface. That extreme descent is too vivid a memory to be dismissed, and it is odd that no one has ever been able to find a man answering to the description of my guide, Abdul Raisel Drogman, the tomb-throated guide that looked and smiled like King Kefren. I have digressed from my normal connected narrative, perhaps in the vain hope of evading the telling of that final incident, that incident to which all is most nearly and certainly an hallucination. But I promised to relate it and do not break promises. When I recovered, or seemed to recover, my senses after that fall down into the black stone stairs, was quite alone and in darkness as before. The windy stench, bad enough before, was now fiendish, and I had to acquire enough familiarity at this time to bear it stoically. Dazedly I began to crawl away from the place where the putrid wind came. With my bleeding hands felt the colossal blocks of a mighty pavement. At once my head struck against a hard object, and there I felt of it that I learned it was the base of a column of unbelievable immensity, whose surface was covered with gigantic chiseled hieroglyphics, very perceptible to my touch. Crawling on, I encountered tightened columns of incomprehensible distances apart, and when suddenly my attention was captured by the realization of something which might have been impinging on my subconscious hearing long before the conscious sense was aware of it. From still lower than the lower chasm of the earth's bowels proceeded certain sounds, measured and definite, and were like nothing I had never heard before. They were very ancient and distinctly ceremonial, I felt almost intuitively, and reading in Egyptology had led me to associate them with the flute, the sambuc, and the sistrum, and the tympanum, and the rhythmic piping, droning, rattling, beating. I felt an element of terror beyond all the known terrors of earth, a terror particularly associated with personal fear, and taking the form of a short objective of pity for our planet, that it must be held within its depths such horrors as lie beyond these age-panic cacophonies. The sounds increased in volume, and I felt that they were approaching. Then, may all gods of the pantheons unite to keep the like from my ears again, I began to hear, faintly and afar off, the morbid and millennial tramping of the marching things. It was hideous that footfalls so dissimilar should move in such perfect rhythm. The training of the unhallowed thousands of years must lie beyond that march of earth's innermost monstrosities, padding, clicking, walking, stalking, rumbling, lumbering, crawling, all to the abhorrent discords of those mocking instruments. And then, God help the memory of those Arab legends out of my head, the mummies without souls, the meeting place of the wandering cause, the hordes of the devil-cursed pharaonic dead of 40 centuries, the composite mummies led through the undermost onyx voids by King Kefren and his ghoul queen Nycteris. Those trampling drew nearer. Heaven save me from the sound of those feet and paws and hooves and pads and talons as it commenced to acquire detail. Down limitless reaches of sunless pavement, a spark of light flickered in the malodorous wind, and I drew behind a column of the enormous circumference of the column I had might escape for a while the horror that was stalking million-footed towards me through gigantic hostels of inhuman dread and phobic antiquity. The flickers increased, and the tramping and the dissonant rhythm stood sickeningly loud. The quivering orange light stood there, faintly from a scene such stony owl that I saw grasp a series of wonders that conquered even fear and repulsion. Bases of columns whose middles were higher than human sight. Mere bases of things which must dwarf the Eiffel Tower to insignificant hieroglyphs carved in unthinkable hands in caverns where daylight could be only a remote legend. I would not look at the marching things. That I desperately resolved as I heard their creaking joints and nitrous wheezing above the dead music and the dead tramping. It was merciful that they did not speak, but God! Those crazy torches began to cast shadows on the surface of those stupendous columns. Heaven take it away! Hippopotami had not should have human heads and carry torches. Men should not have the heads of crocodiles. I tried to turn away, but the shadows and the sounds and the stench were everywhere. Then I remembered something I used to do in half-conscious nightmares as a boy, and I began to repeat to myself, "This is a dream! This is a dream!" But it was no use, and I only shut my eyes and pray. At least that's what I think I did, for one is never sure in visions, and this I could never sure be known. This I know I could not have known. I wondered whether I should ever reach the world again, and at times would have furtively opened my eyes to see if I could discern any feature of the place other than the wind of spiced putrefaction, the topless columns, and the thaumatropically grotesque shadows of abnormal horror. The sputtering glare of multiplying torches now shone, and unless these hellish places were wholly without walls, I could not fail to see some boundary or fixed landmark soon. I had to shut my eyes again when I realized how many of the things were assembling, and when I glimpsed a certain object walking sullenly and steadily, without any body, above the waist. A fiendish and undulant corpse gurgle, or death rattle, now split the very atmosphere, a charnel atmosphere poisonous with naphtha and bitumen blasts, with one consorted chorus of the ghoulish legion of hybrid blasphemies. My eyes pervasively shaken and open, gazed upon an instant within a sight no human creature could ever imagine without panic, fear, or physical exhaustion. These things had filed ceremonially in one direction, the direction of the noisome wind, where light of their torches showed their bended heads, or were the bended heads as such as they had heads. They were worshipping before a great black fader belching aperture, which reached almost out of sight, and which I could see was flanked at right angles by two large staircases whose ends were very far away in shadow. One of these was indubitably the same staircase I had fallen down. The dimensions of this hole were fully in proportion to those of the columns. An ordinary house would have been lost in it, and every average public building could have been easily moved in and out. So vast was it a surface that only by moving the eye could one trace its boundaries. So vast, so hideously black, so aromatically stinking. Directly in front of this yawning polyphemus door, the things were throwing objects, evidently sacrifices to religious offerings, to judge by their gestures. Kefren was their leader, sneering King Kefren, or the guide Abdul Reis, crowned in a golden shint, and intoning endless formulae with the hollow voice of the dead. By his side knelt beautiful Queen Nycteris, who I saw in profile for a moment, noting that the right half of her face was eaten away by rats or ghouls. As I shut my eyes again, I saw what objects were being thrown as offerings to the fetid aperture or its possible local deity. It occurred to me, judging from this elaborateness of this worship, that the concealed deity must have been one of considerable importance. Was it Osiris or Isis, Horus or Anubis, or some vast unknown god of the dead, still more central and supreme? There is a legend that terrible altars and colossi were reared to an unknown one before ever the known gods were worshipped. And now I steeled myself to watch the rapt and sepulchral adorations of those nameless things. A thought of escape flashed upon me. The hall was dim, and the columns heavy with shadow. with every creature of that nightmare throng absorbed in shocking raptures. It might be barely possible for me to creep past to the faraway end, to those of the staircases, and ascend unseen, trusting to fate and skill to deliver me from the upper reaches, where I was. I neither knew nor seriously reflected upon, and for a moment it struck me as amusing to plan the scariest escape from which I knew to be a dream. Was I in some hidden and unsuspected lower realm of Kefren's Gateway Temple? That temple which generations could have persistently called the Temple of the Sphinx? I could not conjecture, but I resolved to ascend to life and consciousness if wit and muscle could carry me. Wriggling flat on my stomach, I began the anxious journey towards the foot and the left-hand staircase, which seemed more accessible of the two. I cannot describe the incidents and the sensations of that crawl, but they may have been guessed when one reflects on what I had to watch steadily in that malign, wind-blown torchlight to avoid detection. The bottom of that staircase was, I have said, far away in shadow. It had to be to rise without a bend to the dizzy parapet landing above the titanic aperture. This place placed the last stages of my crawl at some distance from the noisome herd, though the spectacle chilled me, even when quite remote at my right. At length I succeeded in reaching the steps, and began to climb, keeping close to the wall of which I had observed the decorations of the most hideous sort, and relying on safety of the absorbed, ecstatic interest with the monstrosities watched the foul-breathed aperture, and the impious objects of nourishment they had flung on the pavement before it. Through the staircase was huge and steep, fashioned out of vast porphyry blocks, as if for the feet of a giant. The ascent seemed virtually interminable. Dread of discovery and the pain which renewed exercise had brought to my wounds combined to make that upward call a thing of agonizing memory. I had intended on reaching the landing, to climb immediately onward, whatever staircase might mount from there, stopping for a last look from the carrion abominations that pawed and genuflected some 70 or 80 feet below. Yet sudden a repetition of that thunderous corpse gurgle and death rattle chorus, coming as I nearly had gained from the top of the flight, and chewing its ceremonial rhythm, which was not an alarm of my discovery, caused me to pause and peer cautiously over the parapet. The monstrosities were hailing something which had to be poked itself out of the nauseous aperture to seize hellish fare that proffered it. It was something quite ponderous, and even as seen from my height, something yellowish and hairy, endowed with a sort of nervous motion. It was as large, perhaps, as a good-sized hippopotamus, but very curiously shaped. It seemed to have no neck, but 5 separate shaggy heads springing in a row from a roughly cylindrical trunk. The very first small, the second good size, the third and the fourth equal, and the fifth largest of all. The fifth, no, not so small as the first. Out of these heads darted curious rigid tentacles, which seized ravenously on the excessively great quantities of unmentionable food placed before the aperture. Once in a while the thing would leap up, and occasionally it would retreat into its den in a very odd manner. Its locomotion was so inexplicable that I stared in fascination, wishing it would emerge further from the cavernous layer before me. Then it did emerge, and at the sight turned and fled into the darkness, up the upper staircase that rose before me. Fled unknowingly to incredible depths, and ladders inclined planes, which no human sight or logic guided me, for which I must further relegate to the world of dreams, for want of any confirmation. It must have been dream, for the dawn would have never been found on me, breathing the sands of Giza before the sardonic dawn flushed face of the great Sphinx. That great Sphinx, my God! That idle question I had asked myself on sun-blessed morn before. What huge and loathsome abomination was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? Accursed as the sight, be it in dream or not, that revealed to me the supreme horror, the unknown god of the dead, which licks its colossal chops in the unsuspected abyss, fed hideous mortals by the soulless absurdities that should not exist. The 5-headed monster that emerged, that 5-headed monster as large as a hippopotamus, that 5-headed monster, from which it is as merest forepaw. I survived, but I know it was only a dream. And that concludes Under the Pyramids by H.P. Lovecraft, written for and with Harry Houdini. Do tune in for other tales from our channel.